This week, we welcome Peter Smith from Zscaler to talk about what does zero trust mean to you. Next, we dive straight into the security news, discussing the police playing copyrighted music to stop them from being taking videos of them and posting them online. Border agents can now search phones freely under a new circuit court ruling. Microsoft warns enterprises of a new dependency confusion attack. Old security vulnerabilities left millions of IoT devices vulnerable. A simple and yet robust hand cipher. Zero trust in the real world. Clubhouse and its privacy and security risks. Google launches open source vulnerability database. A hacker tries to poison the water supply. Cyberpunk 2077 makers have been hit by ransomware. Multiple security updates affecting TCP/IP in Microsoft Windows. And in other Windows news, remote desktop vulnerabilities are abound. Lastly, we close out the show with a very special pre-recorded interview with Wheel, Qualys researcher who helped discover the infamous Baron Samedi pseudo vulnerability. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. With the skills gap increasing, it's more important than ever to train your staff effectively and efficiently. Offensive Security provides training for your organization designed by the same minds behind Kali Linux. Here are two recent offerings from OffSec. OffSec Academy gives you the chance to earn industry-leading OSCP certification with dedicated one-on-one mentoring. You can also try Proving Grounds Enterprise, created exclusively by Offensive Security's InfoSec experts for highly realistic simulated networks. Visit securityweekly.com/offsec to learn more.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man who recently bought some vinyl entitled The Sounds Wasps Make. Turns out it didn't sound like wasps at all, because he was playing the B-side. Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome everyone to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 683, being recorded on February 11th, 2021, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. I am the sole person this week in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. Of course, Mr. Larry Pesci is here with us remotely. Larry, welcome.
Well, I actually got a chance to do some little tune-up on my video settings and like rearrange cameras and have this like thing called a ring light now because like this like sucks.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, like this is better, maybe.
I like the ring lights. It looks good. Yeah, yep, it's nice. Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Thank you very much. That looks really nice, Larry. Your setup is actually pretty awesome. It looks like a nice little Elgato touchpad there.
Oh yeah, the Elgato.
The Stream Deck.
I thought that Tyler was speaking Spanish there for a minute. Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us. Jeff, welcome.
Always a pleasure, Paul.
What is your background? Is that Garth and what is that movie?
Wayne's World.
Wayne's World. Yeah, is that Wayne's World?
Yeah, it's Wayne's World.
Very nice.
Party time.
Since they had a Super Bowl commercial.
Yeah,
got me
yeah.
all nostalgic.
Right?
Yeah.
Mr. Lee Neely is here with us. Lee, welcome.
Cheers. Glad to be here. Looking forward to some more fun.
Absolutely. If you want to stay in the loop all things Security Weekly, please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. You can subscribe to all of our shows on the Security Weekly network via your favorite podcast catcher. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for our mailing list, and join our Discord server. Joining us today for a sponsored interview by Zscaler is none other than Peter Smith, the VP of Secure Workload Communications. You can learn more by visiting securityweekly.com/Zscaler. Peter, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Paul.
Formerly of Edgewise, we want to make sure
that's right.
Make that clarification. It's hard. I mean, branding is hard. I've been down those roads so many times, right? Multiple name changes and things like that. Acquisitions, right? We were acquired, so branding is a thing. And it is now a Zscaler branded product, but all the great things that we talked about in previous segments that happen to be branded Edgewise.
Yeah, that's right. It's now called, instead of Edgewise, it's called Zscaler Workload Segmentation.
Very nice. Very nice. That's awesome. Well, it's always nice to have you on the show, Peter. And I think we wanted to start by tackling the phrase zero trust head on. And that was a term that I might have seen first in your marketing when you were the previously named company. I'll try not to keep repeating the previous name, right? When you used the previous company, I think you were one of the first companies really that I saw that was really kind of trying to market around and popularize the term. I think it comes under scrutiny because, we're security nerds and we take things very literally, especially if you've done programming, right? Like if you say peel half the potatoes and put them in the water, when you look down in the water, there's half the potatoes peeled and half isn't, and they're boiling in the water, right? Like we're very literal. So we see zero trust. I think that's where some of the contention comes from.
Yeah, no, I hear that sometimes that how can you have zero trust? You have to trust something. And I agree with you. Taking zero too literally sets up a debate about what zero means. And, I think what does zero mean, right? It's 0 degrees Fahrenheit. What is that versus 0 degrees Celsius or 0 degrees Kelvin? You need to qualify it, right? And zero trust means, in my opinion, it means zero assumed trust, zero default trust, zero privilege without any sort of validation. And so zero trust is really just to say my default position for you is that I just never trust you unless you can attest to requiring the access that you need and you are who you say you are. So yeah, I get the whole what does zero mean? But I think you can play word games pretty easily with that.
Yeah.
Look no further than temperature.
But I like what you're saying because it speaks to some of the system hardening and things we would do when you bring in a new process or application, for example, or even a new machine. You would not let it talk to anything because you're like, whoa, what is this thing? And then you observe it and you're like, oh, you need to do this. Okay, now you can go do that, but you can't do anything else, right? I mean, you used to do this. Interesting when the first Microsoft Windows network worms were running around. We had to, when we built machines at the university, because it was such a large network and we were just putting in some of the first firewalls in the very early 2000s, I had to put them on their own isolated subnet that nothing could connect to it. So essentially zero trust. It could go out to go get patches, but if I let them put it on the regular network, bad things would happen. They would get infected by the time you got finished building it back in the day. And I think that's probably some of the early examples of where I was applying this zero trust concept to networking.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen zero trust quite a bit over the past, 20 years. Application whitelisting is a perfect example of zero trust. Even to the point that you were making earlier about, university networks. Universities were some of the first environments that were really forging a path towards NAC, network access control. And, it's a different tune on the same theme, which is for NAC, I'm going to validate you before I give you admission into the network.
Yep.
But once you're on the network, it's sort of loosey-goosey around what you're allowed to do. It's very coarse-grained, I should say. And, zero trust as we think of it today, some people are starting to call it SASE and stuff like that, is really just taking that concept, but making it a far more granular control, right?
Mm.
Are you seeing different types of zero trust when the word's being thrown out? Very similar to other kind of big buzzword or brand things when we had, EDR come out. There's a big fuss about what EDR actually is. So from zero trust standpoint, what are some of the other kind of things? I know your guys' zero trust is one of the ones that, I actually like because you're going very granular down to, processes and hashes and protocols and network, all the way up the stack. But what are you seeing in the market as far as the mislabeling or alternate use of that word?
Yeah, it's a great question. I obviously won't call out any vendors or anything, but I think the challenge I have with zero trust is when vendors apply that label to a solution that actually does allow unless determined that it shouldn't be allowed. A good example of that is very common anti-malware capabilities. In most cases, the default position is that we will allow the software to execute. And if we determine that it's behaving in a way that we don't like, or if we at some point in the future determine that it's malicious, then we'll take remediative action. But I think the entire essence of zero trust and what should be the litmus test of whether or not your product can even be declared as zero trust is what is the default position? Is the default action that you just don't gain any access? And then the second part of it is, what is the periodicity of revalidation, right? Are you doing it once? And then once you say, yeah, I am who I am, then from that point forward, you can do whatever you want. And I think one of the key tenets of zero trust is continuous revalidation. And, at the expense of pulling it back to ZWS, every connection, every time it occurs, it doesn't matter if it happened less than a millisecond after the initial connection. It has to be revalidated, reauthorized that it should have the access that it has. And I think if you're not doing a default no access position, and if you're not doing continuous revalidation at virtually every juncture, every possible opportunity, I just don't know if it's really zero trust.
It's a great parallel there of why firewalls were never as effective as what we're talking about right now, because you would say, oh, allow this port. And especially early firewalls were like, yeah, sure, like whatever. If it's, TCP port 80, just let it in or out, like didn't, do any inspection. I think we then moved to, smarter firewalls that could do some inspection of that, but they were trying to be generic for all traffic flowing through. I think the real answer was what you were just describing, right? That constant validation and checking at a much more granular level than I think we were able to apply before.
And just one quick additional point on this about firewalls is that firewalls are really in the business of authorizing what you are trying to do. An address support in a protocol, that is not who you are.
Yeah.
You're simply using that to make a connection, right? What you are is the software and the device and the container that is trying to make that connection or receive that connection. And so, I know that we're trying to avoid the semantic argument on the word zero, but I think there's a real semantic argument to be made around really what do firewalls do? They validate how you communicate and what you say. If you're a layer 7 firewall, it's what you're saying, but they are not validating who you are. And I think who you are is actually more fundamental to achieving a high security outcome than trying to divine by staring at a packet that, oh, this is probably good, it's probably bad based on what's inside the packet. Well, that can only be based on what you known to be already bad behavior, which fundamentally is not a zero trust posture. Who made the connection and who received the connection? If you can validate that those entities are supposed to authorize, I think you should care less about what they're saying, because at the end of the day, you should only be admitting trustworthy entities.
It's interesting, Peter. You spark so much, so many questions and great thought trains, right? And I think a lot of what we're trying to prevent, that we haven't necessarily always had the right tools and techniques, is impersonation. Is kind of what you were just describing, right? I may trust I may trust this process. I know it communicates on these ports, but how do I know someone hasn't poisoned that process or impersonating that process? So trusting who not just the user is, but who the process is, who the machine is extremely important, because so many of the attacks, if you think about it, one of the common denominators is it's really an impersonation attack.
Yep. Yeah. Think about a phone call versus a Zoom meeting, right? You get onto a phone call and you see a number come in. You sort of think, I think this sounds like Paul. He's saying the right things. I'll believe it's Paul. You get onto a Zoom meeting and you see the person, you see it's not a video recording. You have a higher degree of acceptance that you are legitimately talking to the person you're talking to.
Right.
And so, that level of validation, understanding who it is that is communicating, is so essential, because you've seen spoofed phone numbers before. Spoofing a phone number is
when my friends figured that stuff out and learned how to use VoIP, I was getting calls from the White House every other day, right? And I'm like, wait a minute.
So do you see pulling this kind of granular control and pulling the borders back to the trust agents and like the processes and the hashes? Do you see that as a bigger overhead or a more substantial lift from an administration standpoint? Obviously, you get a lot more granular control, and it has a lot more potential for viability across multiple networks and disparate or hostile networks. But the overhead and to do that, is that something that is a concern that has to be considered?
Man, that is a great question, because there is a really counterintuitive element about getting to this level of granularity. Let me set up an example. Let's say you've got 100 firewall policies, and each of those firewall policies is a /32 via a port to another /32, and you've got 100 of those. Now, you as the administrator, you go in there and you say, I don't really want to manage 100 policies, so I'm going to try to consolidate these. And you look at the list of policies and you say, oh, look at that. All of these fit into this /25. So you say /25 via port to /25. You went from 100 policies to one policy. But you also allowed 26 addresses access that didn't need it. And so my point is that firewalls, when you generalize policies to simplify operations, it's often the case that you are allowing some more access than is absolutely required by the thing you're trying to protect. And how many times have people listening to this call tried to configure firewall policies, and you get yet another from that subnet, and you just switch to using a CIDR block instead of using discrete policies? It happens all the time. And you're effectively giving over provisioned access. Now, what is the counterintuitive part of identity? So if I itemize a list of approved software on a set of approved devices or containers, that's allowed to talk to a list of approved software on a list of approved devices or containers. That's one policy, just like that /25 policy, but it will only ever be the legitimate, verified, approved software running on the legitimate, verified, approved devices that are allowed to interact. So even though you consolidated that down to one single policy, it had absolutely zero overexposure. So the counterintuitive part about having precise identity at the control plane is that it radically simplifies the policy object model without allowing the over-provisioned access that is common to generalized firewall policies. Does that add up, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So once you have, and most of the zero trust models that I've seen, there's a stage of learning, and one of the real big caveats, and I think one of the biggest downfalls of bringing a zero trust model into most organizations that are a little bit older or have a large organization or environment is the fear and or the risk of what if there's already something bad in the network and we have this zero trust in a learning mode where it's learning behavior that then gets adapted into policy. What are the good mechanisms, or what are the best practices to kind of ensure and start to realize that that's less of a concern with a model like this, whereas if you have a firewall or things, that is already a problem?
Yeah. There's a lot to that. So let me start with, there's certain filters that need to be applied to a set of policies. What are those filters? There's obviously software reputation. No software should be admitted into a policy that is known to be malicious or is suspect. Ask the administrator what their response is if you deem it to be suspicious. Number two is behavioral scoring. So does this software, which is similar to this other software, exhibit the same types of behaviors? Or is there something wildly different about it? For instance, an LSAS process on a Windows box that suddenly starts acting like a network scanner. Why would that happen? Well, probably because there was some sort of memory injection or something like that. So identifying deviations from behavior is a really important aspect of it. And the third is something we call internally capabilities classification. And the simple way to think about it is this: what can you do with administrative tools versus non-administrative tools that are a fixed function business application? It's a lot harder to make Microsoft Dynamics behave like something it's not than it is to take Netcat and put it into a while one loop and it suddenly is an Nmap scanner, right? So bifurcate the list of software into fixed function business software versus multi-use administrative tools so that you can apply differentiated access controls to those. So even though you need to admit curl, because curl is used to go download some package via cron job, you admit it, but you bound it very tightly, whereas you give a little bit more latitude to the fixed function business application.
I realize every time you come on the show, Peter, you're way smarter than I am, by the way.
Oh, stop.
I'm just keeping my gears turning, following along. What I think is interesting about that, and also kind of a segue, is we obviously have studied the SolarWinds thing, and we'll continue to study it, right? And it's become almost nauseating, right? What I think is the real opportunity is to talk about the software that you trust, that you may not have always thought about, what, like, if or how or why you trust that particular software. It was interesting when, especially the sudo vulnerability came out and talking about something else in the headlines. I was like, I get, for lack of a better term, the heebie-jeebies. I have 3 Linux computers, and my 2 desktops and my laptop, they're all Linux. And so I do sudo apt, upgrade all the time, because I want to be a diligent security practitioner and make sure I get the latest patches. Ironically, I had to use sudo to get the sudo update. But all this software comes down on all my systems all the time. And I always wonder, I'm like, how much do I trust all that software? Like, I understand it's largely 95% open source, and I could go review all of the lines of code. Just kind of a little teaser for the segment at the end of this show. It took a team of researchers 2 months to find 2 vulnerabilities that were chained together to come up with the sudo privilege escalation vulnerability. And they're way more skilled than I am at finding bugs in C code specifically, right? So how do I manage this process, Peter? How do I put boundaries around what I'm installing? Because we all do this all the time, not just on our, I'm the anomaly because I run Linux on my desktops like a crazy person, but a lot of us have, let's just use Linux as an example. We trust all this software coming down. And, when I started thinking about this, I immediately started thinking of Zscaler. I'm like, I remember Peter saying really smart things about how to solve this problem, right? And kind of alleviate this anxiety of being able to trust all of the software that's coming down that I can't possibly, even with other tools, really validate all of this, right?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head around packages. There's a really interesting article, I'll send it out later, about Node.js exploit. And it's buried very deep in this hierarchy of nested packages, because when you do a yum install Python npm or something like that, you're not just installing one package, you're installing the entire dependency chain.
Right.
And somewhere buried deep in that dependency chain, this person, in this case it was Node.js, put some information that collected a lot of sensitive data just as a proof of concept. It wasn't for malicious purposes. They just wanted to understand if they could get large organizations to use default installations that by default collects a lot of rich information. And sure enough, they did. And so how do you mitigate this? And I think one of the things that's really important is to be able to define a behavioral pattern for a given set of services or applications. And you were talking about SolarWinds just a moment ago. This is a great example where there was the initial point of compromise, the actual SolarWinds software, but then there was a secondary tool chain that was downloaded. And so if you had defined the pattern of interactions around what SolarWinds is allowed to do, and then you had a secondary set of tools that were trying to use that access, but were not authorized, that would be a really strong indicator of compromise. Now, let's be honest, it's also a strong indicator that the administrator messed something up. So I think number one, it requires diligence on the part of the administrator to actually ask the tough questions. Why did this change? Understand the why. And number two, it requires that there's a strong baseline establishing what those normal patterns are for a given piece of software. And, one other point that you touched on was about impersonation, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that, to me, there's a ton of, morals to the Solarwinds story to be taken away. Mm. But to me, the moral of the story is that these attackers recognized that I need access. And what system has the most access in an environment? Your configuration management system is probably in the mix. Your monitoring system definitely is in the mix because you've configured every one of your security controls to allow that monitoring system to monitor every one of the services that you care about. And you're using firewalls. And so, of course, the attacker gains a foothold on the monitoring system. They know they've got the access. They use a malicious payload to piggyback and impersonate that connection. The firewall sees it and says, hey, you came from the right address. You went to the right address and port. Looks like the right protocol. Come on through. Mm-hmm. And so piggybacking and impersonating this allowed access and gaining a foothold in one of these core infrastructure systems that has vast access, your backup infrastructure, configuration management, mm-hmm. Active Directory, monitoring services. The list is pretty darn long. Those are points of compromise that can just snowball out of control. So protect them, profile them, understand what they do, and only allow those actions to occur, nothing else. And the fifth one, ask why when those behaviors change.
Yeah, I think that's important because how many times have in the course of our careers we've mistaken an administrator either making a mistake, honest mistake, or changing something in the course of their job, and we mistake that for malicious activity. I can tell you how many times it's happened to me personally, right? I'm assuming it's happened to everyone else as well.
Of course, you get fatigued. Administrators get fatigued when they had a week and a half long back and forth with an app owner trying to gain access to that database, and they keep banging their head on the table because it's not going through. And so they just sort of say, okay, this made it happen. But in the meantime, they actually allowed 25 other things that shouldn't be authorized. So ask why. Why isn't this working? Use tools that help you understand why things aren't working and quickly remediate them, mm-hmm. So that you don't wind up in the position where you've over-provisioned access to the degree that allows something like a Solarwinds to occur.
Now, one of the real big advantages to Zero Trust and to all of the granularity and control you have is the ability to respond, right? This is one of the things that we're always harping on, is that time to detection and time to remediation. Well, when you guys have the ability to do a lot of the behavioral analysis and it's environment or network agnostic, then your ability to respond very quickly and respond accurately based on heuristics or behavior, that exponentially closes that delta, right, for that time to detection and time to remediation. Does that apply to all Zero Trust models?
That's a really good question. My answer would be that it depends on what you attribute behaviors to. So here's an example. If you attribute a set of behaviors to an address, it's very difficult to understand why behaviors may have changed to be able to have the required information to even validate whether that change should be authorized, because it's this anonymized interface that says 10.10.10.10, but you have no idea what's making that address behave the way it's behaving. So I think that it is applicable broadly to Zero Trust as long as you attribute the behavior to the appropriate source of the behavior. And if you're at too high of an abstraction and trying to apply attribute behaviors to those abstractions, you don't have the necessary data to be able to say, why is this authorized? Why is it not authorized? Again, which is why I think you need to get to first principles with Zero Trust. What made the connection? Wasn't an address, wasn't a NIC, wasn't a server. It was a piece of software talking to a piece of software. So where do you attribute behaviors? The software, because the software made the connection. And so once you say that there are other aspects of zero trust, you have to ask yourself, what am I attributing this behavior to? Is it truly the first principal object, the most fundamental thing that exhibited that behavior? If yes, then you're probably doing it the right way. You know, Tyler, you mentioned something a minute ago that I realized I didn't respond to, and I think it's a really interesting point. You were talking about what happens when something gets admitted that shouldn't be admitted. And I think one of the other key points to zero trust is that we're not just saying that it's a facade, a ring fence in the world of firewalling. We're saying that every path of communication between every piece of software on every device is validated always, every single time it communicates. So let's pretend like the policy allows device A to talk to device B. Now the attacker moves laterally from device A to device B. Well, in a multi-stage attack scenario, they're stuck at B. They're trying to get to D. So they get to B. Now they're going to thrash about. And what they're going to do is send up signals that says, well, this thing is trying to do a netcat out to the internet. Then it tried to do a, some other tool, an Nmap scan. Those are all going to throw up signals that say there was an unusual amount of block activity that does not normally occur on this device that's happening. And I think that's as good a signal as you could ever ask for.
And that also provides you more visibility than you typically get with the ability to follow those breadcrumbs back very quickly, because, like you said, each one of those communications, each one of those paths and attributions where behavior and detection has the ability to be able to have a log or have a characteristic or have some kind of a connection. Each one of those can be followed and is very almost a single pane of glass, not to use one of the industry buzzwords, but you really are getting a much more granular and much more complete picture that is providing something that you can action on, right? Like from an incident standpoint, you're able to provide actionable attribution much more quickly and respond and then mitigate appropriately.
And those signals are perfect for a SIM for correlation. Understanding that you've got unusual activity, identifying what that software is really important, so that you can, you see a connection that goes out to the internet and you say it's going to an address that may be a command and control address. It's coming from PowerShell. Oh, that little tidbit of information that it came from PowerShell, doesn't that increase your confidence that you're correct, that it's trying to do some sort of command and control significantly? So understanding the origin of the connection, the destination of the connection is really important. And of course, at this granular level of logging that we're talking about, all of that is made available for all connections everywhere to the SIM.
I had more thoughts on Solarwinds, but I didn't want to beat it to death either, because I think that
chase that ambulance, Paul.
Right, because for me it wasn't about Solarwinds, right? It was about what I trust and the things that we have to do and have to trust that attackers will take advantage of, right? And but my Linux example was kind of a play on that as well, but you extrapolate that out into applications and certificates, right? I think one of the end goals, I think we've seen through evidence, was to gain access to certificates so they could create more software that was automatically trusted, right? And it was really a play, on trust at the end of the day, and how important that was to review, manage the trust between your applications, services, machines, and users. And that, I know I'm now making it sound easy, but that's really what we have to protect, and that's really what the attackers are looking to exploit.
Yeah, the thing about making it easy, a tool cannot eliminate the complexity of your environment, right? Your environment is complex. It's complex, right? What a tool can do is take the friction out of the process so that it makes decisions where decisions can be made by a machine. And it simplifies the process of validating using human judgment for the things that can't be validated. And so, zero trust is hard. There's no, if, ands, or buts about it. But the tool chains make it achievable. They make it something that will not sort of cause operational friction beyond the controls that you have today. And in some cases, I think we're able to protect all of these paths of communications with less friction than a traditional firewall.
Yeah, when I was a Unix admin, we used to try and do chroot jails for processes. And I don't know that chroot jails were necessarily designed for applications more so than users. When we used to have shell accounts, I think that's really where the roots, pun intended, of chroot jails it came from. And we tried to extrapolate those out to running applications, and it was just a pain in the butt.
Oh
right?
My gosh. Nightmare.
It was a nightmare, and we needed better. Again, removing that friction. There was too much friction, I guess is my point in that story.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering, where does this not work? Where do we where's the this won't fix that? Where,
are you asking in the sense of where does zero trust fall flat?
Or where should I never use it? Because it's not designed for that.
Mm.
Yeah,
I mean, it's really attractive.
I think zero trust is a complex proposition when you're talking about general internet users going to like publicly exposed services. Most of those solutions today rely on filtering for known malicious activity. And it's difficult to ask your users to provide some sort of proof of trust or identity. I guess you could argue that sort of a CAPTCHA is sort of a zero trust model, but it's really only validating that you are human. It's not validating that you are who should be using this, right?
And it introduced so much friction that Google had to basically take the human out of the equation and use machine learning to validate if it was a human or a machine, and not have you fill out the crosswalk or any of that stuff because it was too much friction.
I think it's just a no-brainer for managed devices. So devices of your employees connecting into business services, devices that comprise those business services, and the access from those entities out to the internet. When you have that level of control, I think it's just a no-brainer. But when you're dealing with customers, it gets a little bit difficult to ask them to install a piece of software on their device to gain access to your pay-for service. So I think that's probably the place where it is least effective.
This solves a lot of problems, though, that we've traditionally also had issues with things like ICS or maybe very specialized equipment, or even anything inside the OT space, right? Does this also apply to protocols or things that are unknown? Maybe they're using a proprietary ICS protocol, something that's not like Modbus or DMP3, but is more of an ICS or OT or critical aspect. Is there any caveats to what is currently able to be protected via this mechanism?
It's a good point. I think as long as the entity uses the socket interface, independent of what type of actions they take on that socket, it can apply. It is also worth pointing out that the approach of identity-based segmentation is always an agent-based approach. And the reason is because the network can't see into the operating system to understand what software made a connection or received a connection. And so you have to have a point of presence on the device to be able to understand and authorize that connectivity. So devices that you cannot install that agent on would not be eligible for end-to-end identity-based verification, which isn't to say you can't do identity. It's just that you can only do it on one side of the connection. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It makes sense. I mean, you think about it, your PLCs are real fragile to any kind of improper interaction, and you can't run the agent on them. So you still protect them differently. But your ERP system's a whole nother matter.
Yeah, so the way I think about the PLC systems and whatnot is, if you're putting the Purdue model in place, at those boundaries, those should be proxies where you can authorize using identity any connectivity from a ZWS managed entity to the front door of the proxy. And then the proxy, once that validation is done, passes it to the known PLC or other unmanaged entity, as we call them. Unmanaged just meaning not running a ZWS agent. So there's a way of implementing these solutions so that you get that boundary protection as is recommended, and you get the identity-based protection sort of end-to-end. It's not truly to the front door of the IoT device. It's to the isolation boundary, which would be a proxy that is enabled for ZWS.
So one of the Purdue levels, before you're switching Purdue levels, you can have a monitoring or agent there that then does the proxy for that agent.
You have hit the nail on the head. Transparent forwarding, but in the process of doing that transparent forwarding, it will not forward unless it knows exactly what the end-to-end connectivity is.
That's awesome.
So something was mentioned by Dimitri in the Discord group about what kind of latency or lag do these agents add to the system?
Yeah,
or is that
we've talked about this previously, and the number continues to go down. So right now, where we sit on latency is 5 microseconds to do validation. And we're only able to do that because of the way we function, which is a system called interposition. And what that really means is that when a piece of software asks the operating system for a socket, connect, bind, listen, something like that, we interpose and we say, wait a second, before that goes through, what's actually asking for it and what are they trying to connect to? And then we instruct the operating system how to handle that connection. So we'll either respond to that system call with a permission denied message, or we'll respond to the operating system and say, wire this connection through. And that process means that we do not touch packets. We don't watch packets. We don't handle them or at all. We inject ourselves in, we do the validation, and then we pull ourselves out. And what that means is that we don't bear the burden of having to handle every packet. So we don't have any CPU increase. If you were to push, let's say you were on an AWS instance pushing 40 gigabits per second, it would literally have 0 CPU effect for ZWS because we are not in that 40 gig path. We inject ourselves, we validate, we pull ourselves out. That gives you low resource consumption and extremely low latency.
Cool. That's kind of cool.
So I have a question.
The team really, they came up with a very, very compelling architecture. They heard that we needed to be as low latency as possible, and we didn't want to chew up a bunch of resources. And a lot of solutions in this space, they'll use proxies that live in user land. Now, just think about what you need to do to get data into that. It comes in the NIC, you get an interrupt, you go up to user land, you go through the proxy, it does what it's going to do, you send it back down into kernel space, and then out the NIC onto something else. Well, that's a pretty circuitous path. And that means you have to plumb every single packet up into user land, process it, and then send it back out the NIC. You can imagine that adds latency and significant processing overhead. Mm-hmm. And so the challenge for the team was, how do you do this with the lowest latency and minimal processing overhead? And the answer was, you insert yourself and you get out of the way once you've done the validation that you need to do.
Here, I thought you were going to say you were going to put some code in the NIC.
Oh, goodness. Can you imagine?
Oh, God, no. That'd be
oh, no, I know.
Really ugly. I liked it when you said system call interposition. Can you say that again, Peter?
System call interposition.
Oh, I love that.
Coming to a theater near you.
I was impressed with that phrase. It just sounds really impressive. That's really cool.
And next thing you know, Andrea's going to have another new word for the week that she's going to ask us to use.
Right.
Interposition and bifurcation. Like, no, not at the same time. Please, no.
Sorry. Did someone else had a question?
I have a question.
Jeff.
How are you guys positioning this? What kind of story do you have for companies that, let's say, are more driven by compliance than security?
That's a good one.
Well, and I was
lot
just
of
reading. I'm restating the question I usually ask: is where does this fit into PCI? If that's easier
well, it's
for
funny.
you.
I was actually just about to go to PCI. So when you do your audits, one of the biggest challenges we hear about is documenting what is currently going through the perimeter security. And one of the benefits of this is it is a complete firewall replacement. And come audit time, it produces the output that you actually need for that audit. It itemizes every single path of allowed communication between every device, every individual piece of software. So you have a complete document of exactly what is allowed into, out of, and inside the PCI segment. And I think that's a really complicated problem to solve. How do the services interact inside the PCI segment? If you're using a traditional VLANing mechanism with a firewall in the front of it and you're ring fencing, you're going to see what goes in and out of the PCI segment, but you really don't have any idea what is communicating inside the segment. Getting that data is burdensome, and these types of solutions, ZWS in particular, makes it trivial to be able to identify every path of communication into, out of, and inside the PCI segment, down to the device and the software communicating, and documenting every single time it used that connection so that you can identify policies that no longer are needed, as well as policies that are actively used.
But if I understood the conversation earlier, you're more validating, let's say, source and destination in this scenario, but not necessarily justification of what's going through. You don't care about what's going through. You're identifying who's talking to who in what way.
I don't justify why. Right. You're correct. I don't justify why. I do focus on who and what. I don't focus on, well, I record how. So who is a piece of software using a device that is communicating with an address and a port. I itemize all of that. But the question I think you're getting at is intent. So what is the intent of the connection, and is that authorized or not? Behavioral models certainly help, and also being able to exclude anything that is known to be malicious or suspicious. But I cannot tell your auditor that this business application requires this connectivity because this is how the business application is designed. That has to be validated by someone.
Right. Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Peter, did you have a demo for this segment?
Oh, yeah. You don't have. We can touch on it quickly.
Yeah.
I think you guys have largely seen it. I was really just going to comment on Solarwinds and this whole piggybacking thing, abusing allowed connectivity. That's right. I think the name of the game here.
It's interesting. You've given a demo that's shown that exactly, which is
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I won't rehash it now, but that's the gist of it. If
my only other thing, Peter, was if you've got like a customer use case, you don't obviously have to name the customer, but someone that you can think of that makes a good example that has adopted this technology and is like a really kind of compelling case. Our audience often asks that, like, it's really cool to like hear how it all works and have you guys ask questions. Like, that's a huge part of it, and we love that. But like, all right, now tell me about like someone who's actually using it and has derived value from it. And I asked that because I know you have many of those stories in your back pocket, right?
Microsegmentation. I guess there's a lot of ways to look at use cases when you're talking about microsegmentation. Oftentimes, microsegmentation is in and of itself the outcome.
Right.
But it's also used, as Jeff was saying, for specific scenarios around, for instance, PCI, replacing the firewalls or getting better insights or control over the PCI environment. I would say the majority of our customers have a specific microsegmentation outcome that they're trying to achieve. And the net is that they're trying to protect every device in their cloud and data center. And they're trying to do that by identifying the boundaries of the business application, isolating those devices, and controlling all communications into, out of, and within that segment. So I'm trying to think of something that wouldn't reveal the name of the organization. In agriculture company that is located all over the world. And, the thing about agriculture is it's a really big mix of some things that you would expect and some things that you probably wouldn't expect. Agriculture often includes a lot of genomics and other sorts of science that when you look at a strawberry or something, you probably don't look at it and say, oh, there was hardcore science that went into this, but oftentimes that actually is the case. So you've got a lot of intellectual property that needs to be protected and secured. You've got a lot of sort of supply chain management systems where it requires on-time delivery of given resources, and you've got IoT devices that manage everything from conveyor belts to packaging and whatnot.
And here I'm thinking there's just some farmer that has selling some strawberries, right?
It's crazy. You look at these industries and you're like, I think I understand it. And then you get involved in it and you say, wow, I am shocked by how varied this is. And I think that is the moral of the story is pursuing microsegmentation is often about solving a lot of small problems. It's a highly varied problem space because everybody's infrastructure is nuanced. Everybody's got, like in these larger blue chip companies, they've got 30 plus years of legacy computing infrastructure, right, and they need one solution that covers all of that complexity. I need my containers protected, and I need my legacy, Windows boxes that I didn't get around to upgrading or patching protected, and everything in between. And so I think the challenge here is being able to handle a wide variety of scenarios with a simple, repeatable process. And I think that is the value that we've delivered most, is that it doesn't matter really what devices, what software, what entities are involved. We've got a set of automations that allow you to package up those entities in a very simple way into a segment object, auto segment to create all of the policies for allowed inbound, outbound, and internal access, evaluate the impact of those policies, and then remediate once if something is missing from the allowed policy set. We call it auto resegmentation. And that really completes the policy lifecycle. And the reason we're able to do that is because we've simplified the policies. The reason we're able to simplify the policies is because of identity. And so people often overlook identity as just being a security concern, but fundamentally microsegmentation is an operational concern. And identity makes policies simpler. Simpler policies drives easy automation. Easy automation makes it an achievable outcome. And that is fundamentally what ZWS is all about.
Okay. And Peter, do you support older operating systems? Like how far back do you go in Windows?
Yeah, on Linux, we go back to the 2.6 kernel and all the way to latest and greatest.
And on Windows systems, how far back do you go?
On Windows, we go back to 2008, Windows 7, and we are adding legacy Windows support, like super legacy Windows support.
Like XP legacy Windows support?
I don't know if we'll do desktops because we aren't really a desktop concern. It's more a server concern.
Server side,
But doing things like Windows 2003 and so on.
Does people still have 2003 out there?
Oh my gosh, do they? Yes.
Wow.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
That's awesome. Lee, did you have a question?
Oh, I was going to say so much for my Windows for Workgroup systems.
I can commit right now that we will never support NT or newer.
Yeah. Oh, so we just got a comment in Discord. How about NT4 Service Pack 6, baby?
Yeah, I'm gonna steer clear of that one. Pretty sure
I can't imagine why.
Not gonna get built.
I'm sure there's some people out there that still have it though. Hopefully, very few and far between.
So, and there's some operating systems that we will never support, like mainframes. But that's what that entire proxy architecture that I was referring to is all about. It's being able to identify end to end using identity the trustworthiness of a connection as close to the thing that is trying to be accessed as possible, and then pass it back to that mainframe, for instance, or that, heaven forbid, you have a NT4 box.
Right.
Yeah, well, and you should have other mitigations around that NT4 box. It's pretty fragile by today's standards. So, what am I correct in thinking you're staying in Linux as opposed to other forms of Unix that are out there?
No, we are expanding that. I can't say specifics, but
let's not bust an NDA.
Yeah, I mean, I got to say, since joining Zscaler, it's really been just transformational. When we joined Zscaler, it was really about completeness of vision. They're well known for their ZIA product. You can ignore the Z part because it's always Z at the beginning. So it's Internet Access, IA. They secure the outbound Internet access, and then there's ZPA, which is securing the front door, which is private access. And that's like, get rid of your VPN. Use this very lightweight approach that connects you end to end from your desktop, validating the user identity, device identity, straight to the front door of the business application. And now with ZWS, we're protecting those application to application communications inside the cloud and data center. So it really is this like perfect end-to-end vision of protect the front door, protect the back door, protect everything in the middle.
So how would an enterprise look at migrating to that kind of model? I mean, it's not going to be a turn off the firewall thing. I mean, what's the plan?
It's a good point. Typically, the way it works is when you achieve this microsegmentation outcome, renewal time comes up for your firewall. And the question is, are there any paths of communication over the firewall that are not currently covered by policy in ZWS? And we can very easily reconcile that. And then it either inspires, remediating that gap, or retirement of the firewall. But at the end of the day, there is no reason that you would have a firewall combined with ZPA. ZWS. And I think the grand vision here is a complete firewall replacement, whether it's perimeter firewalls, internal data center firewalls, or otherwise. You can protect all paths of communication with ZPA, ZWS, and ZIA.
I would think that those things that you can't do the agent on, those sort of fragile devices, would be outside that complete firewall replacement. But other than that, I can see it.
So they now I can actually say it because it's a public knowledge now. But they just introduced this thing called Cloud Connector, and the way to think of Cloud Connector is it's a device that sits at the default gateway of a environment or a broadcast domain or otherwise. And so I think your point is well heard, that for those entities that cannot be protected using an agent-based approach, the Cloud Connector is a proxy that sits on-prem and acts as that intermediary so that you can isolate and protect all of those devices that cannot run the agent.
So you're doing it a different way, but that works. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any known mechanisms for attacking or bypassing this kind of microsegmentation? The only one that I've seen and successfully messed with, not against your product, by the way, is some race condition stuff. But other than that, this seems like a pretty robust and foolproof way of mitigating a lot of the attack surface.
Yeah. So as far as tamper protection is concerned, we've put quite a bit of effort into this. So we've got this capability called termination protection. And when enabled, let's say, for instance, you gained root access to a Linux machine and you did sudo kill-9 against the Edgewise userland component. You wouldn't actually even have a problem because the process wouldn't die. We tap into LSM and we protect our own agent using that LSM framework so that we can intercept those signals and ignore them. If you try to attach a debugger, another example, you will not be allowed to attach a debugger, and it will be, the security team will be notified that a debugger was attached. If you try
Same thing
to do
for unhooking.
That's exactly what I was about to do. About to say, if you tried to unload the security module, you would be faced with a permission denied error. We do this really kind of interesting thing. I'll just give a little detail on it if your audience might find it compelling. So we make a self-dependency. You basically tell the kernel that the kernel depends on this other module, and that module controls what it depends on and whether or not it releases that dependency. And so as long as we hold that dependency, the kernel can't do anything about it because it's not able to remove the module. So it's self-protection to prevent the unloading of the module, the termination of the process, the attachment of debuggers, and so on.
I love that in Linux, like, you don't need to be root to do things that would normally require root, but you can also restrict what root can do by controlling what's happening inside.
No, it's pretty crazy.
It's really amazing. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Peter, any closing thoughts, comments for our audience today?
Let's see. Well, I think if there's any lesson to be taken away from recent happenings, I hope it's eye-opening that attackers will take advantage of allowed access. And the question to ask yourself is, how do I protect the access that my environment requires? It must be there, or my business applications don't work, but also mitigate it from being abused by malicious actors. And in my opinion, identity-based segmentation is the right answer for that problem. Only allow the authorized entities to communicate when they need to communicate, nothing else. Get strong signals when somebody attempts to hijack or piggyback over that allowed connectivity, and it mitigates a lot of problems in the environment. So thanks again for having me, Paul and company. I love the questions, and I can't wait for the next time.
Thanks so much, Peter. With that, we'll conclude this segment on Paul's Security Weekly. Coming up next, stay tuned, the Security News.